Hello there and welcome back to Under the Dome on Town Meeting TV. My name is Bobby Lucier. Today we are about more than a week out of the end of the legislative session, and we're talking about public safety and criminal justice, the work this session that the legislature has done on those topics, two topics that have been front of mind for many folks in the community. We are joined to discuss those topics by Representative Martin Lalonde and Representative Angela Arsenault. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks. Hi.
Great. Awesome. So maybe just start off with some introductions. If you could share what communities you represent and how long you've served in the legislature, what committees you serve on, which will be relevant for this conversation. And maybe we can start with you, Angela.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah, I'm Angela Arsenault. I'm a representative from Williston in the Chittenden 2 district. And I serve on House Judiciary, and this was my first term, so just closing out my first biennium.
Congrats.
Thank you.
Awesome. What brought you to the legislature?
A lot of things, really, but I would say primarily being a parent and being a woman in our culture, and a journalist. I worked as a journalist. I've worked as a journalist for many years, and wrote a lot about parenting and gender roles, and found that there were some pretty common policy barriers that folks run into in our culture, in our communities, just trying to kind of get by and get along as parents in our culture. And I thought, like, there's so much that I want to bring up as a journalist and make people raise awareness about, or maybe I want to get into a position where I can actually influence the policies that are creating these barriers. So I chose that. Fortunately, I was elected, and here I am.
Awesome. Great. Representative Lalonde?
Yeah, I'm a representative from South Burlington, District Chittenden 12, one of 5 representatives from South Burlington. Just finished my 10th year in the legislature. All 10 years I've been on the House Judiciary Committee. And this biennium I've had the pleasure of chairing the committee and having awesome members like Angela join the committee. So we had a very, very strong committee and a very good biennium as far as what we passed.
Great. Now, you both serve on the judiciary. Can you talk a little bit about the committee assignment process? Was that something that you both were interested in, an area that you both, sounds like you've served on it for a while, but an area that you both were interested in working on legislation in this area?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Martin will have much more to say about this, but I had certainly, I chose judiciary as one of my top 2 picks. Had an interest in the law, started law school, and then didn't want to be a lawyer, so I left. But I'd also been a volunteer for a number of years with the Williston Community Justice Center, and was really interested in restorative justice and how that might be more intentionally woven into our criminal justice process, which we'll get to. And I was really fortunate to work on that with Chair Lalonde and also Representative Karen Dolan, who's really been leading that work for a number of years. And I've been really lucky and thankful to be on this committee as it is chaired by Representative Lalonde.
Awesome.
That's very kind. Yes, no, it was. So as far as committee assignments, it's interesting because there are a lot of factors, and I had the good fortune, I guess, of last biennium I was in leadership as an assistant majority leader. So I was involved actually in 2 sessions or 2 bienniums where I was helping figure out who should be on different committees, and you have to look at lots of different factors. You have to look at the party, you have to look at geography, you look at what people's preference is, and you try to give them one of their first 2 or 3 preferences. And you look at the gender balance and all those things. It's really quite interesting to try to put together 13, 14 committees with all those factors. But I also had the benefit of being in the room there, so I could try. And I knew I was going to be, by that time, I knew that I was going to be the chair. So I kind of tried to make sure I can't let any of the other people know that the chairs. Hopefully, they don't watch that. I had kind of the inside that I could lobby to have a very strong committee, and it ended up having a very good committee. So,
thank you both for your service to the state. Just a reminder that if you're tuning in live, you can call in with your questions for our representatives here. 802-862-3966 is the number. You can call in and we'll put you live on air with your question. And so with that, maybe we'll turn to our topic for the day, which is public safety and criminal justice. This is something I think that folks are struggling to wrap their heads around in this, in our community, and there's sort of a philosophical, I guess, challenge here as far as supporting folks who are struggling in our community. I guess maybe we could just start with a big picture question about how the two of you have been thinking about public safety and criminal justice this session, and what you've been hearing from constituents, from testimony. Just where are your heads at? Where have your heads been at on this topic this session?
I can start with that. Actually, even before this biennium started, a lot of people who were out on the campaign trail and talking to constituents, one of the top issues was a concern about public safety. And that became, last year, the first year of the session, we started working on some of those issues. But during the off session, we were hearing even more about the concern about public safety. So last summer. And I was hearing from representatives from around the state who were hearing from constituents. So it wasn't just a Chittenden County issue. It was pretty much all across the state I was hearing that this was a concern. So we understood that this was going to be a top priority for the Judiciary Committee this session, and really started working on this last fall, some of the specifics, reaching out to stakeholders to find out really what are the main issues that we should be looking at, what are the problems we're trying to solve. We understand generally that people are concerned about public safety, more specifically about drugs, about retail theft, and about some other issues as well, increases in violent crime. So really started to talk to the court personnel and prosecutors, defenders, victim advocates, CJCs, the Community Justice Centers, talking about all the different folks before the session even began, because our session, we have only 12 weeks to get our bills out and to the other side, to the Senate and vice versa. So there's really, if you wait until January, it's going to be really tough to really address the issues. So we were pretty well set once we got into the building in January. And one of the things, and we'll maybe get into this a little bit more, but one of the issues that really became evident very quickly is that probably the biggest driver of this problem is the court processing time. How long is it taking for individuals to be held accountable for their actions? And even before the pandemic, the courts were not keeping up with the cases coming in. A backlog was growing of cases. And when the pandemic hit, courts were closed down. There were fewer cases filed, but there were more. And after the pandemic, it seemed to just keep on getting worse. The number of cases filed versus the number of cases being disposed of. So really, we were seeing that the number one issue was trying to make individuals have their accountability closer to when an offense has occurred. And when I say accountability, that doesn't mean necessarily incarceration. It can mean probation. It could mean getting somebody into treatment. It could be having somebody go to a CJC, a community justice center. So, but the point was that somebody could commit a misdemeanor, could be retail theft, and they're cited into court. They don't have their first court date for a couple months, and they don't have their case resolved for months, if not years. And so there's that time period where there's not supervision of the individual can get in more trouble. Often it does happen. So there's not a deterrent effect of that accountability. So we looked to see what kind of resources were needed by the criminal justice system. We really tried to evaluate, well, how can we get the courts moving more quickly? And it's not just giving resources to the courts, it's to the prosecutors, the defenders, the victim advocates, the CJCs. And that actually was an ongoing issue that even started before the session. I presented to the Appropriations Committee in December, actually, what we saw as the problem, what we saw by that point, what the needs were. And it was significant staffing for all those different elements. So eventually, we did pass out of the House H-880, very close to the time when we had to send over everything to the Senate. and had a 2-year plan for the revenue source and for the resources that were necessary to get a handle on the backlog, with an idea that we'd try to resolve it in 3 to 4 years by really putting some resources towards it. We did get part of it in the end. We did get about half of what we asked for, so we're hoping that we'll see some progress in that. So,
Okay. Well, we'll get into H880 a little bit more in detail in a second, but Representative Arsenault, big picture, how have you been thinking about criminal justice this session?
Well, I think certainly everything that Martin just shared has, I'll back up a half step and say that I'm, one of the reasons I'm so glad to be on this committee and to be learning from Representative Lalonde is that there was a plan. And that's a really nice thing to come into as a representative, and perhaps especially as a new representative, to come in and have the big picture plan shared with us from the start. I really appreciated that, and it's nice to have that to communicate to constituents as well. So understanding the approach that we were taking as a committee, I was thinking a lot, sort of personally, about balance, something I think a lot about in life, and I think another reason I'm grateful for our committee is that I do think that in all these things, even though we're talking about accountability, and as Martin said, sometimes people assume that means incarceration. It doesn't always mean that. And we really, in everything we've done this session and this biennium, we've tried to strike a balance between public safety and seeing every offender as a human being, as a whole human being, trying to understand the underlying drivers and reasons that they might be committing crime. And I know that Chair Lalonde has worked with chairs of other committees, Human Services, Healthcare, to really try to take a more holistic approach, understanding that that's what we need ultimately. You can't, and we often say that the work of our committee is really at the end of a long line. And by the time folks are involved with the criminal justice system, there have been many perhaps breakdowns or missed opportunities along the way to intervene. Not 100% of the time, but really the majority of the time. And so we have tried to look at and consider, again, the whole human and the big picture, and trying to balance that very real and important need for all Vermonters to feel safe, and the need for us as Vermonters to treat all offenders, people who are committing crime, with dignity and respect, and getting them help when they need it.
So maybe let's jump in now to the court backlog, expanding the judiciary. So what was what did that look like in H880? And then not all of it actually made it into the budget. So what were some of the dynamics there on that conversation?
right. So one of the things was just identifying a revenue source, which had to do, and I'm not going to be able to get into the details because I'm not in Ways and Means and deal with taxes, but they identified a revenue source that would grow over a 2-year period. So we identified about $17-18 million that was necessary to get the additional staffing for court staff. And this is beyond what the governor's budget recommended, because his budget already recommended having 2 additional judges, for instance, and we ended up having 3 additional judges in the end. But it didn't have a recommendation for more court staff, and you have to have court staff to support what the judges are doing. The state's attorneys are overwhelmed by the number of cases they have. So our thought, well, actually the governor's budget would have required a cut of up to 8 state's attorneys, prosecutors. We actually thought that we needed probably 15 more from just looking at the numbers. And our proposal in H880 would have done that. The Defender General's office is very important for processing cases as well. and we had significant ask for the Defender General's office. Victims advocates is an additional area where our individuals are working in state's attorney's offices, have hundreds of cases that they're trying to track and help victims, and it's really critical to have that assistance for victims to see through this process. And so there was a significant funding investment there as well. So, and I'm sure I'm missing some of the other areas, but across the board there was funding for that. And what we in our proposal, where we ended up in the House, was really allowing the Defender General, the state's attorney, the court to decide exactly where the money would go. I mean, we listed what the needs were, but since it was a 2-year period, we were going to allow them to prioritize. That somewhat has occurred in what has ended up in the budget. It's about $8 million more than the governor's recommended budget, so it was about half of what we were asking for. The only issue is that it doesn't have the revenue source, and we don't know how we're going to get to the full $16, $17, $18 million worth of investment that we think is needed to get a handle on the backlog. And we are looking at we have statistics, which is a great thing, to see how we're doing. There's something called a clearance rate, which is the number of cases coming in versus the number of cases going out from courts. And if you're at 100%, you're just staying even. Our goal is to get at 125%, meaning that they're really getting on top of the backlog. We're going to monitor. I'm not sure where they are right now, but this will allow us to adjust next year. If we're still lagging, we'll be able to have a good argument for more resources to keep on moving the cases. So,
right. And those revenue sources, there was a couple of new taxes, right?
Which are not part of the picture anymore.
Which are not moving forward.
Correct.
And do you have any sense of why those new taxes, why there wasn't an appetite for those new taxes in the Senate?
Or in the governor's office?
Or in the governor's
office.
But
yeah.
more surprisingly, I think in the Senate, given that it's democratically controlled.
I don't know. Yeah, I didn't have conversations with him.
What were the taxes that were proposed, in your mind?
It was a corporate tax and fees for investment companies. So it was a corporate tax and a higher margin. So, yeah, not as far as, so how they fund these things, is very important. But our role was to say, what do we need to move the court cases along more expeditiously, and we provide, this is what, through all of our hearings and discussing with the stakeholders, what we need. Now you guys go find the money, is how that kind of works.
Right.
And so you can imagine it's a little frustrating when the Ways and Means Committee finds a way and to address a priority that's been stated as a priority by pretty much all involved. Certainly the governor states public safety as a priority, but hasn't properly funded the entities who would contribute to improve public safety.
Right.
Yeah. It did seem like on this issue and others that there was a trend this session of the House proposing some new revenue mechanisms that then did not quite make it into the final budget, this being one example of that.
Right.
Maybe we can move now to a bill about retail theft, which also has to do with accountability here. And I don't know if either of you want to talk, just kind of introduce H534 here. What would this bill do? What will, if it's, so it's passed, but it's not signed by the governor yet,
Sure.
right? Okay.
Yeah, no, I can address that. That is a bill that I introduced last fall as well. So the idea there is really to look at repeat offenders, and we're hearing we've heard from particularly, but not just Chittenden County, but particularly Chittenden County, also Rutland, Bennington, where they're having individuals who are having repeatedly are stealing from our retail shops, and because they're misdemeanors, they don't take priority in the court, and it can take months for there to be accountability. So what the House passed was was a bill that matches what a number of other states are doing. So right now, $900 is a threshold that if somebody steals over $900, that becomes a felony, or $900 and above. It becomes a felony. Felonies do have a little more teeth to them. They move more rapidly generally, or can move rapidly. Although in some cases they actually move slower, but putting that aside. But it elevates the seriousness of the particular offense if it becomes a felony. So what this bill would have done is, over a period of time, if an individual is stealing from multiple locations, under current law, those are all individual offenses. What this would have done, the bill from the House would have said you can add up the total amount of the value of the goods over a 14-day period, and if it's over $900, it can be treated as a felony. And it gives the prosecutors just additional options or tools to deal with that. That's not where we ended up. The Senate didn't like that, the Senate Judiciary Committee, and they sent something back that essentially said the first offense would have a penalty of 30 days. The second offense would have a penalty of, I think it was 2 years. The third offense would become a felony. The fourth offense would become a 10-year felony. So it was just for each repeated, so it was repeat offender, and each additional offense would have a little stronger penalty or a harsher penalty. But that didn't sit well with us, because we didn't want somebody who's stealing groceries in poverty that over 4 different times they've stolen groceries over a period of time, that all of a sudden they're a felon. That just did not at all feel right to us. So this bill went to Committee of Conference, and where it landed is kind of in between. It's if there's a second offense, it is a higher penalty, but there has to be at least $250 of value stolen. And then the third offense is a little higher penalty, but again, it has to be not like the groceries that are stolen, although I think you can probably steal $250 worth of groceries pretty easily these days. So actually, by the time you get to a fourth offense, you're almost at that $900 limit anyway. And that's where we landed with that particular bill. So,
do you see retail theft as a public safety issue?
So yes, I mean, I think it is in part a public safety issue, and I think a big part of this is that we were hearing from so many people that this was like, retail theft is what we were hearing the most about, that it was the sense of lawlessness, which I think is part of what public safety is how do you feel safe? Is there a sense of lawlessness? And retail theft was definitely contributing to that. Needles being found on the street and open use of drugs is another one that you have that feeling of lawlessness. We also dealt with, and I don't know if you're going to ask about this, but some auto theft issues, which are a little bit different, but that's also been a big increase in auto thefts. And once again, these things, public safety, it is the sense of security for the community. And so all of these kind of combined offenses that we're seeing a lot more of kind of contribute to this feeling that we are not safe in a safe community.
Representative Arsenault, have you heard from constituents about retail theft, or what was your thinking on this?
Oh yeah, I mean, representing Williston, a town with quite a bit of a lot of retail outlets and large retailers,
Yeah.
and working and volunteering at our community justice center, I would say that the vast majority of cases that we handled there were retail theft cases. So, and I know that, going back to what I was saying before about the interconnectedness of multiple challenges that we're facing, we know that there was some organized retail theft happening, still is. So, where there's folks who are kind of working in exchange for drugs, committing theft, not for things that they're going to keep or use themselves, but to sell or to give to someone who's going to sell them in exchange for drugs. And so there's that interconnectedness that I was learning about and hearing about through both my work at the CJC and in testimony. I would say, retail shop owner after retail shop owner coming before our committee and telling us really the brazenness with which the crimes were being committed and their frustration level. A lot of people were saying they had great concern for their employees who, in some of the shops on Church Street or something are, younger employees, high school and college age kids who, they didn't feel safe working in the stores knowing that folks were going to come in and just take things. It's not like they were trying to be subtle about it. And so when you get to that level of overt, I guess lawlessness or the appearance of lawlessness, that's when I think it really does become a public safety issue, and certainly is something that I've been hearing about from constituents. Mm-hmm. The numbers, the actual data, sometimes doesn't support the perception. That I don't know that we can say. I do know at a certain point in the session, in fact, crime was coming down and to like pre-pandemic levels, which is important to know, but also you have to acknowledge and validate how people feel and just their perception of what's going on in our communities.
Yeah. If I could just add a couple of things with that, just to certainly, some of the statistics on retail theft, at least, were on an upward trend. But absolutely, I think that we're having the benefit that the crime rate is going down. But I think it's important that the retail theft bill is just an additional tool for prosecutors, and actually not the most important thing that I think we've done with respect to retail theft. I'll go back to the money that we put towards the resources we're putting towards the courts and prosecutors. Getting those cases processed more quickly is much more important than this bill that we passed, in my view. I think also as important, and I think Angela will get into this a little bit more, is what we were doing with restorative justice as far as another avenue for individuals, particularly first-time retail theft offenders. So there's that. And one further item that we had in the bill and ended up getting kicked around different bills and finally did pass in S-195 was reinstituting a particular sentencing alternative called what's called generally work crew, but it's something that allows an individual for usually would be a low-level misdemeanor, and from what we understood from prosecutors and defenders is a sentencing alternative that was often used for individuals who committed retail theft. But last year, the Department of Corrections ended that program, and we've reinstituted that. So somebody who does this program, which is called community restitution, has some sort of community service or job service or education, any number of things. And if they don't show up, they go right into being incarcerated, but usually for a fairly short amount of time. But it's been seen as a very important sentencing alternative. And so there's all those different things that we've done to deal with retail theft. And I would also go back to saying, how do the individuals get to the point where they feel the need to steal from stores for supporting their addiction, for perhaps, and really trying to work with other committees, or at least pushing and supporting what other committees were doing to expand treatment, to make that more available for individuals. So
I want to get a little further into S-195 in a second, but first I think Representative Arsenault, I just want to ask about the Community Justice Center in Williston. So when someone comes in for a retail theft crime, what's the course of action there? What does that typically look like? So
community justice centers, kind of broadly speaking, one of the things that makes this alternative so important and useful is that anyone who's coming in as the responsible party. We have responsible parties and impacted parties. And a responsible party will come to the center and sit with someone one-on-one to do what is just called an intake. And it's a conversation kind of like this, and you just talk about what are you here? What brings you here? What did you do that got you here? What was going on? What led to you, in this case, stealing from that store? And even, can you talk a little bit about what you were thinking when you stole? And it's really opening up, I guess, peeling back layers of the event to try to identify what support services the responsible party may need. And then a CJC can help connect people to services. So it's not about providing the services there at the CJC, but connecting folks to services. And then there is, in most cases, a panel. So you go before, as a responsible party, you go before a panel of community members. These are volunteers from the community in Williston, it's Williston or Richmond or Huntington. They live locally in Burlington. Folks from Burlington will sit with you, and you tell your story as a responsible party, why you did what you did, what supports you might need, and together with that panel of volunteers, you come up with a plan to provide repair. And repair can be to the impacted party, who is welcome to be present if they wish, which is a whole other, we haven't even talked about victims' rights and how restorative justice really centers the victim, whereas the traditional criminal justice process is very much focused on the offender. And so the idea with restorative justice is to repair the harm done to the community. So there will be what will you do to repair harm done to the individual? And in the case of retail theft, it could be an employee who was there and was scared and didn't know what to do when you stole all those, whatever it was, or even if it's a large corporation. In Williston we have Dick's and Marshalls and these, owned by very large companies, but there is still harm done to those companies when the offender, responsible party, steals. So there's some retribution made even on that level. And to the first responders, the law enforcement officers, it might just be a conversation with a police officer, like, thank you for sending me here instead of into the criminal justice system.
Right. So it's the decision of the police as to whether
it can be.
Okay.
We have both law enforcement referrals, and also if law enforcement refers the case to the state's attorney, then the state's attorney's office can refer back to the community justice center.
Okay. Cool. Thank you for explaining that. So maybe we'll turn back now to S-195. So what does this bill do as far as changing conditions of release for offenders?
So that part of the big picture again is we have individuals who have committed an offense, and because of the court backlog, it's taken a long time for their cases to be resolved. So what happens in the interim? And there are certain individuals, and it can often be driven by addiction or not necessarily but that they are released. So when an individual comes into the criminal justice system, in the first hearing, one of the first hearings, there's a determination of whether the individual might flee, might not show up for court. And part of that decision is whether to have bail as an incentive for the person to show up to court. People are not being held on bail for low-level misdemeanors generally in Vermont. But in any event, so if they're being released without bail or having paid bail, there can also be conditions of release. Like if it's a retail theft, for instance, don't go within 300 feet of the store that you stole from. There could be a curfew. There could be other requirements, such as going to treatment. But what happens, though, is there's this long period of time when they're not having their case resolved, where they have conditions, and those conditions are being violated. And that's actually the number one, the most misdemeanors we have in our courts, and it's, I think, something like 3,000, are violations of conditions of release, which in and of itself is a crime. So what this bill does is it tries to address that fact. And probably the most important part of the bill is that it sets up a pretrial supervision program, which would be staffed by the Department of Corrections. So there would be individual, essentially almost like a probation officer, but it's a little bit different because the person hasn't been found guilty. But it's set up where certain individuals who have at least 5 cases against them or have been violating conditions of release can be referred to the program, and they will be helped essentially to make sure they show up to court on time, to make sure that, if treatment is part of the condition of release, that they're going to treatment. So it's somebody that will help the individual comply with the conditions and show up in court. That's a big part of it. And it's also to have some supervision of individuals as well, to make sure that, if they are violating conditions of release, that's understood that you're not supposed to be doing that. So part of that can be electronic monitoring of an individual. That might be deemed necessary as part of this program. But that's really the most important component of that bill. In addition, that's where the work release that I mentioned before ended up in that bill. So, but it is, so we're trying to look at, get the courts functioning further. We understand there's issues with people who have a long time before their cases. Let's give them some help as well. And then there's also an expansion of restorative justice that is part of this as well for what's called pre-charge diversion. So there's lots of different, this is all kind of one big package of trying to deal with the issue that we're dealing with.
Right. Anything to add on that bill in particular? Representative Arsenault?
Probably not on that bill. I was
Okay.
going to jump into
Yeah.
645, the restorative justice
Yeah,
bill.
absolutely.
It's now a good time to do
Let's
that.
do that. Yep.
So H645 is a really pretty, it's a pretty cool bill, I gotta say, and it was really amazing to watch it come together. Again, I want to give a ton of credit to Representative Karen Dolan, who worked with so many interested parties, from the community justice centers all over the state's attorneys, the Defender General's Office, the Center for Crime Victim Services, with help from folks at the Vermont Law and Graduate School, and certainly the Attorney General's Office, which was sort of, I think, kind of a key component to this bill, was finding out. And I still actually, maybe I'll have to find out from you someday how that conversation came together. I'm not sure I know exactly, but currently, or before H645, there isn't really an entity that oversees the different community justice centers and what they're doing for pre-charge services. We have an existing diversion program, court diversion, which is run through the Attorney General's office. And that same department of the Attorney General's office is now going to set up a similar system for folks who are pre-charged, so they have not actually been charged, they're not entered into the court system, meaning their case is now not going to contribute to the court backlog, but instead their case will be referred to a community justice center. And as I've described, this has been happening in a lot of community justice centers, but the funding has not been very stable. It's been through grant programs from the Department of Corrections, but really, does that make sense to have the Department of Corrections funding a pre-charge, diversion program when those folks are not in the custody of Department of Corrections? So there were a lot of questions and there's a long history actually of restorative justice in Vermont and how this came to be, but what H645 seeks to do is just kind of make it make sense. And we're very fortunate, I think, that the Attorney General's office is willing to hold this. And so they will grant to one entity per county, and that entity may subgrant, in the case in Chittenden County, certainly we have a number of really incredible community justice centers. So this bill in no way seeks to limit the work that they are already doing. The bill seeks to provide some stability and a little more structure to the really effective programs that are already in place. And so it's a really important piece, as Representative Lalonde was saying, to this really gigantic puzzle. And I'm excited also about the provision in this bill that calls for more data keeping, more data gathering. So we'll be able to tell how effective the pre-charge diversion is, because that's something that, again, we haven't necessarily had this centralized repository of this information, and we'll have that now.
It's interesting. Do you have anything to add on that, Bill?
Yeah, I mean, it's just we have a criminal justice system, and we're trying to make a restorative justice system. And it hasn't been very systematic, and that's kind of a big thing, a big part of what we're trying to do.
Yeah, I mean, some of the narratives around the legislation that's been passed this session have characterized the overall sum of these bills as sort of a tough on crime session. How do either of you respond to those kinds of criticisms?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it is tough on crime necessarily. I mean, it's going to sound kind of silly, but we're being sensible about what we're trying to do, and we're looking at this as a big picture. We're not just looking at dealing with drug logs, which we haven't gotten into too much yet, or auto theft or retail theft. We're trying to give prosecutors and law enforcement the tools to hold people accountable, but we're also focusing more on getting the courts to run better. We're focusing on the restorative justice. We're focusing on the work crew, different ways where accountability isn't necessary incarceration. So there were bills that have been introduced that would have much stiffer fines or penalties, including incarceration time. And for the most part, we've steered away from that. I think probably the only place where we have that, where it's a little tougher potential penalty, is with the retail theft and with the repeat offenders. But otherwise, we haven't. I don't think that we're being tough. We're certainly trying to hold people accountable. But when I hear you're being tough on crime, that means you're throwing people in jail for longer periods of time, which actually just doesn't work. That's just understood that if you keep people in jail for a long time, they're more likely to recidivate when they get out of jail, and that doesn't help the community. So if one is talking about tough on crime as far as we're going to be putting more people in jail for a longer periods of time, then we're not doing that. If we're talking about we're trying to make sure that people are being held accountable in the different ways that we've talked about, then that's what we're doing.
Yeah, and I would add to that, again, going back to this notion of balance, and again, I will say a voice that often gets lost in the discussion is the victim's voice. And one of the great things about restorative justice is we know that victims who participate in the restorative justice process come away with a better sense of justice for themselves and closure for themselves that they can't necessarily get when you walk out of a courtroom and some sentence has been handed down, and is it enough? Is it arbitrary? It's just not as. I think we know that restorative justice provides a better sense of justice for victims, and I want to acknowledge as well that folks who have been calling for us to be tougher on crime many of them are victims of crime, and so you have to hear their call, and then moderate. I think as Representative Lalonde is saying, it's not just going to be about long incarceration or incarceration at all. If as we know that should actually be a last resort, and in Vermont we've learned often is the last resort, but. I like the word sensible, and I feel like we have tried to take a balanced, sensible approach in our work. We have focused a lot on crime, And I would hear any argument that we've been tougher in some areas than some folks would like to see, particularly in dealing with juveniles. But I also know that we have our eye on that and are hoping to continue to make some changes in that area as well.
Yeah, maybe now's a good time to talk about S58. And so this is a bill that deals with how the state handles folks who are facing charges and who are maybe 16, 17, 18, 19 years old. Would one of you be willing to just sort of introduce what this bill does and the path that it took this session?
Sure. There's a few things that it does. And one is it does add 3 crimes to what's called the Big 12. So there's a list of 12 of the worst crimes: murder, manslaughter, arson, with death resulting, sexual assault, etc. And it added, and for those crimes, there's a lot of different things that can happen if somebody's charged with that. But when we're talking about juveniles, if you are 14 or above and you commit a Big 12 crime, you start in criminal court but can be transferred to family court, or actually the state's attorney can decide through a different process to start you in family court, but generally would be starting in criminal court. So this adds 3 crimes for 16 and above that would start in criminal court unless the state's attorney makes a decision to start them in family court. And it includes trafficking of a regulated drug, and trafficking is higher than selling. It's a fairly high amount of drugs that can be sold. Aggravated stalking and using a firearm in committing a felony, which are equivalent to the other crimes that are already there as far as these most serious crimes. So that's one thing that it does. Another thing that the bill does, and it's something we started a few years ago called the Raise the Age Initiative, recognizing that youth who commit crimes, it's often can be impulsive behavior. Really, brain development science says that one's prefrontal cortex isn't really fully developed until your mid-20s, and that's what is controlling impulsive behavior. So oftentimes somebody can, as a youth, can commit a crime, and we don't want it to ruin the rest of their life, especially recognizing the brain science behind impulse control and the like. So we've had a program, or we've had an initiative to raise the age where individuals can be considered juveniles and go to family court. And currently it's under 19, and the idea is that would go up to under 20 and then under 21. And that's been delayed again and again because the administration is not really ready to implement that, because it would really put more pressure on the Department of Children and Family. When it's in family court and juveniles treated as a delinquent, they're often in the custody of DCF. So there was a request from the administration to essentially put this off until they had done certain things. They had 5 different goals that they wanted to meet, and I'm not going to remember exactly what they were, but and they just wanted to put the whole thing off until they were ready, essentially. And we said, no, we're going to keep the pressure on you. We'll give you until April 1st of next year, and we want you to report to us every other month on progress on these various goals. So we're holding their feet to the fire, essentially saying, this is your last chance to get ready for this next stage of the raising the age. Finally, the bill deals with how drugs are sold right now. And some of the gaps in our drug laws that makes it very difficult for, in certain situations, for individuals to be held accountable. So a drug might be sold as an upper, a downer. There may be different names for it, and they may have different concoctions of what's in the particular drug. And prosecutors often have to show that the person knowingly sold a particular drug. So you knowingly sold fentanyl. and the individual, it's I guess relatively easy to, well, it's difficult to show that the person had knowledge when it's a concoction that has lots of different things and it's got some sort of street name. So this bill would change the knowingly standard to essentially prevent somebody from using what's called the ostrich defense, putting your head in the sand, or the willful blindness offense. Thank you very much. So essentially, if the person, was aware that their drug probably had fentanyl and actually really tried to avoid that knowledge, they could still be held accountable for selling that particular drug. It's limited to fentanyl. We also expanded our drug laws to include xylazine, which has been a very problematic drug, which there's no penalty for sale or trafficking of xylazine, but this bill would add that. So there's probably a couple other things, but that's the main things that this particular bill does.
Do you expect that this bill will lead to more young people in our prisons?
No, I don't expect, we have very few young people in our prisons. Do I expect that there may be more young people who may start in criminal court? It's possible, yeah, definitely. And we recognize that as well. And I think an important part of this bill is a report back from the courts, prosecutors, defenders, and other entities to tell us how, because this is something we really want to do and didn't have the capacity to do this session, is we want all cases for under 19 to start in family court. But if it's one of the big 12, one of these more serious crimes, we want to have a more expedited path for the prosecutor to move it to criminal court. Because right now, if it starts in family court under current processes, it can take a year of motion practice to move it to criminal court if they want to. So this is kind of like a compromise. We want everything to start there and then think really hard about whether you want to have it in criminal court, as opposed to it starts in criminal court. You can't move it to family court after that without, you've already done the damage. It's already known that a juvenile has committed one of these crimes, and you can't cover that up, because the whole idea of family court is it's confidential. It will allow the juvenile, the youth, to go on with their life without that, once they've gone through the process. So.
Right. Representative Arsenault, what was your thinking on this bill?
This was a really tough bill for us in our committee. And I'm again thankful to Representative Lalonde for working with several of us on the committee to get it to a place that is quite different from how it came to us from the Senate. Getting it to a place where we could, the report that Representative Lalonde just mentioned was a really big deal for many of us who don't want to see the Big 12 expanded. It's now, a big 15. So I much prefer the approach that Representative Lalonde just described of having it as a rule that all youth, no matter what they're charged with, start the process in family court where it's confidential. Especially, of course, many viewers may be aware of a case in Addison County. It was a Chittenden County youth who was charged in criminal court with murder, and the ripple effects are so far-reaching at that point. And I believe that youth was 14. You can't, as Martin said, the brain science tells us, everything tells us that, and what we know about trauma too, that a lot of youth who commit crimes have also been victims of various crimes. So it was a tough vote on that bill, but it was one that we took with, I would say, a great deal of hope and some faith in ourselves, really, to keep pushing, to push the raise the age initiative, but also push ourselves to find a better way for helping youth who commit crimes. And that path does not necessarily, as I've said, end in incarceration.
Right.
Probably shouldn't.
So this bill, none of these bills actually have been signed by Governor Scott, is that right?
As far as I know.
Not
So,
yeah.
I mean, maybe we can just quickly go back and sort of say, okay, this S58, do you have a sense of whether Governor Scott is going to sign this? Is there going to need to be a veto push?
I don't anticipate him vetoing any of these bills.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, the only one I'm worried about, but really I don't think we would see a veto on the pre-charge diversion either. Maybe as it initially was introduced, but we had so many compromises along the way that I think that one's going to be fine as well. So
We have a few minutes left, and I know you also mentioned you wanted to talk about a domestic violence bill. Maybe we can.
And
just
that's
spend a
one
couple
bill
minutes.
that actually has been signed by the governor.
There we go. Yep.
Just last week, I believe, and it's called H27. And what it does is, very importantly, adds coercive controlling behavior to the definition of abuse for those who are seeking a relief from abuse order, commonly called an RFA. So before H27, you had to either have already been physically harmed or be in fear of imminent physical danger in order to obtain a relief from abuse order. But several stories and certainly data tells us that there is a whole series of events and behaviors that will take place in many cases before any physical harm or violence. And H27 creates a path for a person to seek protection before being physically harmed, and really acknowledges that there are other forms of violence, and that we provided some examples of coercive controlling behavior, things like controlling a person's finances, or threatening someone, using, say, the couple's children, or even a family pet, threatening harm to others. So in those cases, no one's actually being physically hurt, but you certainly fear for potential physical harm, and that's a form of coercive controlling behavior. And there are just so many examples of this, and really horrific stories, even here in Vermont, where there were years of this kind of behavior and this kind of abuse, and the first instance of physical harm was homicide. So we're really trying to, we also know that data from December showed that 40% of all calls to law enforcement in Vermont for crimes involving violence were related to domestic violence. This is, when we talk about public safety, we should be talking about domestic violence, and really working to protect and prevent domestic violence, and that requires sort of a whole lot of things we can talk about in shifting our culture and misogyny, and getting back to root causes again, but also creating more tools and more pathways out of abusive situations.
I think we just have like 60 seconds left. If Representative Lalonde, if you have anything to add before we wrap up here.
No, we'll be continuing our work. I think we've done a lot to help with public safety, and there's more to be done. We'll see what the results are of our efforts, and we'll keep on plugging away on these issues. So.
Great. Representative Lalonde from South Burlington, Representative Arsenault from Williston, thank you both so much for joining us on Under the Dome.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank
you for tuning in, and you can tune into this and many more on our YouTube channel on cctv.org. We've got a couple episodes left before the end of the session, so stay tuned.